The Tom Woods Show, episode 1814.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hi, everybody. Tom Woods here. Well, I'm delighted to welcome back to the program Michael Rectenwald, formerly of NYU. Crazy productive guy. I'm going to ask him about that, as a matter of fact. He is the author, most recently, of the novel Thought Criminal, but he's also the author of books that you're going to want to read in nonfiction, Springtime for Snowflakes, kind of a memoir, and his other book, Google Archipelago, is quite relevant, of course, to what's going on right now. And I want to talk to him because he's been writing a series of articles that I will link to on the show notes page, tomwoods.com/1814, on the subject of the so-called Great Reset. And I've had a lot of people asking me to do an episode on this. So here we are doing it. Better late than never. With this whole Great Reset thing, you think, it's got to be some kind of conspiracy thing, but no, I don't think so. So we're going to talk about it today. Michael, welcome back.
Hey, Tom. Great to be here.
I've been meaning to do an episode on this topic for a while, and I just haven't gotten around to it. And when I first heard, and maybe a lot of us feel the same way, we first heard this phrase, the Great Reset, I thought, oh, here we go again. It's another, things are bad enough without people dreaming up fantasy scenarios that don't exist. It just sounded fake, right? Sometimes these people are so over the top that the things they genuinely favor, you think this has to be a parody or somebody made it up or it's, conspiracy. And by the way, the fact that something is conspiracy does not mean it can't be so. People do conspire to do things. Right. Or otherwise we wouldn't have the word conspiracy. But it turns out that this is a case of they're actually coming right out and telling you this is what we're hoping to do. We're going to take this opportunity. We're going to exploit the opportunity presented by this, in particular this COVID thing, to carry out measures we've wanted to do for a long time anyway. And that for people who lived through the war on terror domestically, should ring a bell.
Absolutely. This is like a concerted effort on the part of the World Economic Forum and the United Nations to execute this kind of new, what they're calling stakeholder capitalism. And this is the vesting of as much business to these stakeholders as possible. So these stakeholders will then be basically running the economy. This is the idea that they have. I don't want to get into too much of the question about whether these are monopolies or not in terms of the libertarian conception of monopolies, but this is a tendency towards monopolization, definitely.
Well, let's go back a bit and talk about where this term comes from and what is meant by, what exactly is being reset and who, okay, I'll just put it this way. Who's Klaus Schwab?
Yeah, Klaus Schwab is the executive director of the World Economic Forum. And he has been writing about this reset for decades, really. And what is to be reset is the economy, is the first thing that's to be reset. So it's an economic program, first of all, but there's so much more to it. It's just mind-boggling. What is to be reset is the kind of production and consumption that's going on under current conditions, or previous conditions, I should say now. And of course, the objective is to a, quote, fairer, greener economy. So, of course, the bigger pretext here is the climate crisis. That's always been the main driver behind this, is that we had to cut carbon emissions to virtually zero. We have to have consumption that's everything being sustainable and reusable, and so on and so forth. So this has been the objective of Schwab for quite a while. And, he runs the World Economic Forum, and they meet once a year in Davos with business leaders from around the world and political leaders. And they'll be meeting again in January. It should be very interesting to see what they have to say there. But yeah, the COVID crisis then has represented a pretext for bringing this about. And I think they suggest, Klaus Schwab and others there at the forum suggest that, in fact, it is already doing much of the resetting for us. And I think that has to do with the much more restrained mobility that people have now, the less smaller businesses basically being shut out, and just entirely a different mode of operation so that we don't have as much consumption and we don't have the same kind of production. I think that's the key. They're trying to get rid of certain production.
Yeah, I thought I would ask you, what exactly is the connection between COVID and this? Is it simply that living under the various restrictions that have been imposed gets us accustomed to the idea that there could be restrictions, that we don't have 100% free choice anymore, that we should be getting used to the idea that our mobility and our choices could be restricted in the future, or is there more to it?
Yeah, that's definitely it. It's like the COVID crisis has brought about this restrictions in movement and restrictions in spending, less travel, much more constrained mobility in general. So I think this is definitely part of it. These are the factors they see as contributing to the reset, definitely.
He uses a word that I devoted a whole episode of the show to smashing. In fact, I'll have to put that on the show notes page, the neoliberalism episode. That word neoliberalism, every once in a while, like every million people you meet, there's one person who describes himself as a neoliberal. But for the most part, this is a word no one uses to describe himself. Almost nobody walks around saying, I'm a neoliberal. And yet, oddly, neoliberalism, according to these people, is everywhere. Well, it's a strange phenomenon that's everywhere when it's a term that nobody uses. So that's the bad guy.
Right.
And the Great Reset is going to solve some of the problems posed by this bad guy. Can you flesh this out a little?
Yeah, I mean, neoliberalism, as I said in my Mises article, is a weasel word that really changes its meaning depending on who's using it. For some people, neoliberalism represents like corporatocracy, the collusion between the states and corporations to, get benefits, get regulations that they like or non-regulations and so on and so forth. So it's the privatization of otherwise governmental functions. And that's how many people use it. But then for Klaus Schwab, it means the free enterprise system. So they have all kinds of conflations between like economic and corporate power and free enterprise. So they conflate these two things. And then so he condemns free enterprise as effectively what is the result of corporatocracy. So this is the problem. They want to basically free enterprise system is what they're after. They're really wanting to attack the free enterprise system as such because he says that governments have to get bigger. We have to have more state intervention. Neoliberalism they equate with free enterprise system and laissez-faire economics, a la Milton Friedman, et cetera. And he always brings up Friedman as the enemy here, as the arch enemy, the neoliberal, because privatization they see as the devil here. So it makes no sense because they actually are confusing free enterprise with neoliberalism, whereas the things that they're decrying about neoliberalism have to do with, in fact, corporatocracy, with the privatization of functions, governmental functions, but more importantly, the collusion between the state and corporations.
Now, of course, there is no institution of global governance that exists to enforce such a scheme.
Right.
So it would have to be carried out one state at a time.
That's right.
And so part of me thinks, well, that's good because probably not every state would go along with this. On the other hand, most of them went along with the COVID stuff, you know, and there was no institution of global governance insisting they do that. I mean, in other words, I was thinking maybe this was a way to say, well, probably there'll be some countries that say we're not going to commit economic suicide for no good reason. But if that's what you're counting on, unfortunately, I think we've lived through what disproves that.
Yes. It depends on the buy-in of corporate stakeholders and governmental stakeholders. So what I think he's looking at is kind of like a global network of governments that buy in and also a global network of corporations that buy in. And so, we're looking at this kind of like propaganda. That's why I say it really boils down to a propaganda campaign to really get these shareholders or stakeholders, I should say, to buy into this system. If enough states and enough corporations buy in based on the rhetoric that's being used and the dire predictions about the climate, et cetera, that are floated, then there will be this kind of network of states and corporations who effectively put this into practice. And he says basically every company and every state and every industry must buy in. So if they're convinced of with the rhetoric and they go along with it, then we're going to see enactments of this governmentally.
What, if any, would you say are the forces that might resist this? And let me think out loud here a little bit. There are some things that the elites would no doubt want that they've never been able to get. Maybe they want a world central bank issuing a single global currency. Well, I could see some people finding that to be in their interest. However, good luck convincing China to hand over its monetary sovereignty to a world central bank. Therefore, has not happened. So I wonder if, and before COVID, we did see, without a doubt, certainly in Eastern Europe, but not just Eastern Europe, the resurgence of nationalist feeling. And given that this kind of a plan would require very much a globalist outlook, do you think that there are ideological, philosophical modes of resistance that exist out there that would stop this?
Well, national populism was definitely one of them. This was one of the barriers, in fact, I think, that the Great Resetters see to their agenda. And that's why I think Trump really was an opponent. The Brexit movement and other populism in Europe is definitely an obstacle to this, because any state that's arguing for sovereignty will resist these impulses to globalize everything, to globalize governmentality and the kind of regulations that will be imposed, not from a central state, but through other states' pressures and pressures of other corporations. I mean, you'll see, so the threat of being canceled as a corporation is really at stake here. Basically being canceled by a cartel or by a major player within a cartel. And we see this happening in other ways right now. This could become the criteria by which corporate cartels and major corporate players cancel others who are not abiding by the statutes or the edicts of this Great Reset ideology.
You've written several articles on this for Mises Institute website, so of course I'll link to those at tomwoods.com/1814. But one of them, the third one, uses the title Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics, which is a play on how the Chinese regime used to describe their brand of communism.
That's
communism with Chinese characteristics. What does it mean?
Well, I think that the model for this Great Reset is China. Now, I'm not saying China is the driver behind it, but I think it's the model, because China is what? State-directed capitalism, quote unquote. I have to put it in quotes here. State-directed capitalism, that is, these corporations in China really, they ultimately have to act in the behest of the state and with state sanction. So without that state sanction, they wouldn't have the kind of profit making that they do, and arguably also they wouldn't, without access to the free markets outside of them, they wouldn't have been able to rise as much as they have. But that aside, capitalism with Chinese characteristics is basically modeling the system after China, and that is a very state-directed private enterprise system, which is restricted through state mandates and so forth, and I think pressure from other corporations within it. So, for example, Amazon, this is sort of related. Amazon is canceling many companies that don't abide by, their policies. So if, for example, we saw this with Parler, the free speech debate, and the way Parler is being canceled by Amazon. Well, it could happen on other terms, such that, say, a company is not green enough, or they don't abide by certain precepts, then they could be canceled, and their dependence on these other major, more major players will make them extremely vulnerable to attack.
Hey, folks, let's take a quick minute to thank our sponsor, BitTrust IRA. Well, everybody is interested in Bitcoin these days, aren't they? For obvious reasons. But as you know, the cryptocurrency world can be confusing for beginners. And at the same time, for the sake of diversification, a lot of people are interested in adding Bitcoin to their retirement account. And that is where BitTrust IRA comes in. Bitcoin has obviously been performing very well in recent months and throughout 2020. And BitTrust IRA helps you seamlessly and securely add cryptocurrency to your portfolio. They store your private keys in nuclear bunkers with military-grade encryption, and they've got a 24/7 trading platform with no minimum investments and unlimited trades, plus a team to help guide you along the way if you have any questions. They also offer the lowest trading fees in the industry. Well, go to bittrustira.com/woods today to learn more. And for a limited time, BitTrust IRA is waiving the sign-up fee for Tom Woods Show listeners. That's a $50 value. That's BitTrust IRA, BitTrustIRA.com/woods. Let me ask you kind of an out-of-left-field question, but it just occurred to me. Given that you spent much of your academic career as a Marxist, can you try to put on the old Michael Rectenwald hat and describe for us how, when presented with this kind of stuff, how you would have analyzed it as a Marxist?
That's a great question. See, as a Marxist, I was a true believer. So I would have said this is just state capitalism, as they would put it. You know, like they say about the Soviet Union or China, that's not communism. That's state capitalism. They say that about the Soviet Union. It was state capitalism. So I would probably have said this is not the completion of the full socialist or communist project, that it would take the overthrow of these corporations in the end. But also, I might have also been, as many socialists are, actually prefer these kind of this tendency towards monopolization, because then the enemies are easily identified, and then there's fewer steps to getting to full communism, because you have these major oligarchical operations that then you can overthrow and take over, and then you have you already have a lot of consolidation on the top. So once you have this kind of consolidation, it's just a few steps more to overtaking it. So I would have criticized it as state capitalism, but I would have seen it as a step on the way to full communism.
Very, very interesting. Well, now that leads me to a follow-up question. About 30 years ago, Al Gore said something along the lines of this: henceforth, the central organizing principle of this republic must be the environment.
Yeah.
Now, at that time, back in like 88 to 92, that just seemed crazy. No, nobody was talking about the environment. No, that seemed crazy. This would not happen. But so-called climate change has become, obviously, a major driving force for a lot of things. And in particular, as you say, it is waiting in the wings to be the main justification for the so-called Great Reset. So I guess my question to you again as an ex-Marxist would be, obviously Marx couldn't have anticipated the problem of climate change. Therefore, he doesn't say a word about it. But yet, a Marxist believes that Marx has identified the laws of history and the way things are going to unfold and how we're going to get to the revolution. He doesn't have a lot of details about how the economy is going to function afterward. We just know it's going to be superior. Mm-hmm. Could you, as a consistent Marxist, say, for the sake of humanity, we have to modify Marxism a bit and say that the central organizing principle has to be the environment, and we're going to use Marxist means to make sure that the environment is cared for? Or would that be a deviation?
Well, let me just start a little bit back further. As a Marxist, I did use climate change or global warming as a reason that capitalism had to be overcome. It was the result of capitalist production and the mode of exploitation, which consolidated wealth and also drove this incessant need for production and profit making. So that was always the way I thought as a Marxist. I thought that, without the resolution, without overcoming capitalism, we could not resolve the climate crisis. And so it's always been it's being used as like the new catastrophism that has to be dealt with. So leftists basically have to have a sort of catastrophist notion of something going to be there's going to be this crisis. The capitalism will produce crisis after crisis until it's overcome. And then only after it's overcome, we'll be able to solve things like climate change and things like that. So we wouldn't put the climate first, because as a Marxist, I was more of a humanist. And that is, I believe that, human beings are the real reason for, being. And this is the most important value, is human flourishing. So I wouldn't have put climate as kind of above human flourishing or human happiness, but I would have suggested that human happiness would be unattainable unless we solve something like the climate crisis, which threatens our niche in the environment.
Can you summarize for people the output from Michael Rechtenwald in 2020, the number of books, articles, and everything else you did? Because that was a year that we all had an excuse to be lazy bums, and you did not take that excuse at all.
Yeah, well, I wrote 2 books and published them, had them published. I wrote, I think, 100 articles and did 100 interviews and spoke at, I think, 3 or 4 venues. That was highly curtailed based on the COVID crisis, but I spoke at 3 or 4 venues. So it was a pretty productive year, I'd say.
So I don't necessarily think we need to expect 2021 to have as much Rechtenwald output, but I feel confident that you're working on something. Does it have anything to do with the material we're discussing today?
Yeah, I'm looking at that. I'm still trying to resolve the topic for my next book, and it certainly will involve partially this great reset, and also the kind of system that I think that is being approached or attempting to be put in place, which I call corporate socialism. It'll have something to do with that.
Okay, fair enough. Now, you've also been commenting, because I follow you on Facebook, on what's been going on with social media. We've observed this for years, but usually it would be one outlying person who would find his account was shut off, and we would feel bad for that person. The person did not deserve to have that happen.
Right.
But there was a certain complacency on the part of some of us that, well, okay, maybe that person was a little bit of a live wire.
Right.
But I'm a little bit more reasonable, and I don't have anything to worry about. And then the other day, the king of reasonability himself, Ron Paul, goes to Facebook. Now, his page hasn't been deleted, but he can't post anything to it. They've temporarily banned him from posting because he's violated their community standards so many times. Now, they've never told him in the past that he violated the community standards. They just waited until, I don't know, an accumulation of offenses had occurred, and then they broke it to him. And they never told him exactly what he had done wrong or which post they didn't like or whatever. And the most mild-mannered, kind-hearted, most dedicated, selfless person in the world, even he finds himself under restrictions. So there have been people saying, well, we should just get off all these platforms and go join other ones that aren't going to do this to us. Just tell me, what's your take on all this?
Well, I mean, I would, just picking up on the last point, we should move to other platforms. The problem with that is these platforms are often dependent upon some of these, these cartel members, like, for example, Parler, that's getting canceled because of Amazon Web Services has said that they're not following their precepts about violence and so forth. So they are able to, basically make other options unavailable based on sort of a triangulation of competitors. So it isn't just individuals like the great Ron Paul being canceled. Now we're having corporations being canceled. My take is that strategically, my take is that we should try to hold our ground wherever we have it and spread out, not to abandon these sites, because we'll lose geography, we'll lose network connections, and network connection is the key. We've become dependent on networks, but we're going to be more dependent on networks as this goes on, because as more people become canceled from different sites, the less we can speak to each other, the less we can get our message out, and the less chance we have of actually countering some of the tendencies that are at play here. And I think that tendency is towards this kind of monopolization and this kind of cancellation of all other alternatives. and towards this kind of a great reset into kind of corporate socialism, where you have these oligarchs on top and everybody else effectively relying on, either serving them or relying on universal basic income. I mean, that's the broad sketch. So I think fight it out everywhere you can, spread out as much as possible, encourage other entrepreneurs to set up other sites, and hopefully we can maintain our voices.
I agree with that. I understand people who say, I can't be part of this anymore, so I'm going to leave this platform. And I understand where that's coming from, and I don't criticize them for that. But as you say, as a practical matter, this is what we have at the moment. And us communicating with each other is probably more important than making a statement that is not even going to be heard by those platforms. And it's just not. But having people stay at least connected until we get this all sorted out,
yes,
I think is important. And another thing is, I have a private Facebook group for people who support this show, and I tongue-in-cheek, I call it the Tom Woods Show Elite, and I had that on Facebook for a long time. And for a long time, people said, you've got to move it off Facebook. And I said, no, the problem with that is that people say they'll use a new platform,
right,
but they all have Facebook on their phones. They scroll their news feed all the time. They're already logged in. If they have to go to some other platform just for my group, it's going to wither and die. And so I, for better or worse, am staying on Facebook.
Yes.
Then I started to see that this was not sustainable. I had to move it. So I did. I moved it over to MeWe. And so far, so good. The nice thing about MeWe is it's easy to learn because it functions like Facebook with likes and comments, and it's very easy to learn. And so we've done that. And my fear, and the thing is, I would say my gut steers me the right way 9 times out of 10. But this is one of the times where it did not. I thought this is not going to work at all. The group is still very robust. And not only did I not have a problem, the problem that I anticipated, but I have far more people in recent months signing up at supportinglisteners.com to support the show because they now know they don't have to be on Facebook to do it. I had no idea there was this reservoir of people just waiting to come join, but over their dead body were they going to join that other platform. And so now I've reached some people whose voice I wouldn't have been able to reach at all otherwise. So it turned out to be the right thing, but I still have one foot over on Facebook, but I'm not putting all my eggs in that basket. If that thing ever closes up shop, I'm still fine.
Yeah, I think that's a good approach. It's kind of like a military approach as I see it. You basically hold the ground you have and seek to spread out and to gain other beachheads that you might then use later. I think that's a good approach. But to just abdicate and cede your ground, I think, is a mistake. And I think that what you did there was a way of, you basically had a foothold in Facebook and then moved it over, and if it didn't work, you still kept your Facebook platform and could go back to it probably, right? That was probably...
Yeah, well, so here's what I've got. I still have a page where I post on Facebook. My group is still technically on Facebook, but I'm telling people I don't want any more posts there. I want to keep it as an archive because we have some really, really great threads there from over the past 5 years, and I want people who are members to be able to go back and look things up that we wrote about and talked about. So I want to keep it there. And so I don't want any more posts because every new post is a potential reason for them to shut the page down. So I just want to leave it. Don't breathe. So I have that there.
Right.
But I don't, if MeWe didn't work out, I would go somewhere. I would still try to avoid Facebook. But I just mean, I still post pictures of my kids there because my old high school friends are not going to leave Facebook in a huff. They're just not. And I still have an interest in staying in contact with them. So I'll use it for these limited purposes. I'm not going to give them any money, but I'll use it for these limited purposes. And then, but in terms of things that really matter to me that I don't want to see shut down, I'll put them in on another platform. Now, with all the writing you've done, would you say that Google Archipelago is the one that right now is the most urgent if people could read only one? Or what would you advise people?
Yeah, I'd say Google Archipelago. It's the kind of one that sort of forecasted what's happening now. People said I might have been I'd gone too far, but as it turns out, I hadn't gone far enough because I didn't foresee some of these things that are taking place in terms of cancellation of entire corporations like Parler, for example. But basically, it is the one to go to for this notion of what's afoot, what's the agenda, and how does it fit in? How does big tech fit into it? That's the one that I think is the go-to book. And then if you really want to go out on a limb, I would say thought criminal could be the more premonitory one at this point as well.
Well, I'll link to both of those at tomwoods.com/1814, as well as to your series on the Great Reset. This makes pretty valuable reading at a time like this, and people get a clearer understanding of what we're up against and how we might nevertheless prevail against what seem to be pretty rough odds, but we're gonna keep on pushing because there's nothing else we can do. So, Michael Rechtenwald, I appreciate your time. We have to talk still. I owe you an email about your next course for libertyclassroom.com. We're really thrilled to have you on board there. So thanks again.
Thank you, Tom.
All right, everybody, that's our episode for today. If you like and appreciate what's going on here, oh my gosh, you are going to be like a kid in a candy store over at supportinglisteners.com, because boy, do I give out a lot of bonuses and goodies to people who support The Tom Woods Show, not least of which is membership inside The Tom Woods Show Elite, which used to be on Facebook, but no longer. We have moved over to MeWe, and so far we're doing great over there, and I'd love to have you in the group with us. Entry is at supportinglisteners.com, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.